Roman neighborhood Pigneto begins not far from the Aurelian walls and spreads eastward between roadways and railways. Pigneto's name refers to a dense pine forest which once grew here, but today few of these great trees remain.
The pines didn't grow naturally but were planted by the Carballini family, probably in the 19th century along the edge of the Villa Serventi. This was one of the large tracts of land belonging to a few families, mainly the Serventi and the Tavoletti. It was common to see sheep and cattle grazing here, close to the city center, even entering through its gates at the nearby Porta Maggiore.
What we call Pigneto today was, and still is, bracketed by two ancient Roman roads, the Via Prenestina and the Via Casalina, which radiate out from Porta Maggiore. This is the largest city gate in the Aurelian walls, and it is where people and supplies would enter the capital from the east.
And it's also where water enters the city. 5 important Roman aqueducts merge at this point.
That's right, Pia, and in recent centuries, this has been the entry point for a bulk of the city's railway lines as well. Pigneto was at first not recognized as a real neighborhood. It was known as Quartieri Fuori Porta Maggiore, and officially it was part of Prenestina La Bicana. Pigneto will stretch from Porta Maggiore in a triangular form, ending at the now buried Marinella stream, also known as Acqua Bullicante, which refers to the bubbling sulfuric springs. In the minds of most Pigneto residents, this is the neighborhood's outer edge.
Remains of the Aqua Claudia and the Aqua Marcia are prominent at several places along this route to the southeast of Rome. This low ridge that carried the ancient aqueducts is still a well-used utility strip for modern Rome, carrying the still functioning 16th century aqueduct of Pope Sixtus V called the Aqua Felice, as well as the railroad lines to Naples. Amidst the pine forests, grazing lands and reeds, a few imposing archaeological remains emerge. The ancient Roman consular roads were frequently lined with tombs. The so-called Torione is all that remains of an unidentified circular mausoleum on the Via Prenestina. Since at least the early 19th century, such borghetti or villages had grown around the Terione, near the Marinella stream and along the Prenestina and Casalina roads. Mostly self-built, these informal settlements descended from no master plan and conformed to no building codes.
The 1883 master plan, the so-called Piano Viviani, according to Italo Insolera, does little more than document the sum of private interests. However, the 1909 master plan starts to shape urban growth. It limits development to the area between the Via Casalina and the Via L'Aquila.
Nevertheless, Pigneto is still countryside. In these years, Luigi Tavoletti, a farmer originally from the Marche region, buys land between Via Pigneto and Via Prenestina and moves here to farm. He oversees his crops from the tower called Casina del Cardinale Tosti. With the advent of Roma Capitale, making Rome the capital of Italy in 1870, the population literally explodes, doubling the numbers every 30 years.
Yes, and with it the need for those essential products and services that allow the city to flourish. This means industrial plants. One of the first factories to be built in town is a grain mill on the Via Casalina, just outside of Porta Maggiore. Soon, all sorts of industries sprout outside Porta Maggiore, selling building materials, foodstuffs, pharmaceuticals, and textiles, as well as storage facilities built for merchants to free up space in their downtown shops and restaurants.
The area must also have been a convenient source of labor, since unlike more central areas, Pigneto was inhabited by poor workers and peasants.
Amongst the factories and warehouses, there were also simple taverns, barbershops, and even distilleries. But some of the earliest and largest industrial facilities served the most basic needs of the growing city: street cleaning and public transit. Rome prided itself in efficient public transit and waste management. The Nettezza Urbana, or Rome's urban waste company, actually won an award in 1906 at the Milan Expo for its innovative practices.
In 1904, Giorgio Passage, who ran 2 pharmacies near the Spanish Steps, opens a larger laboratory in Pigneto which allows for cheaper and bigger space for production and storage of the medicines. A few years later, in 1908, Cesare Serrano, a Turinese chemist, receives permission to build his pharmaceutical factory at the beginning of Via del Pigneto, and for decades this is the principal supplier for Rome's many pharmacies.
As the construction boom sweeps across the city, the Cabellini brothers, who are Pigneto locals, respond to the market demands and build their vast cement and machine factories. Then, in the 1920s, not far outside Porta Maggiore, another big warehouse, Società Magazzini Generale, is built, and a massive flour mill and pasta plant, the Pastificio Pantanella, begins operating. And further out, still along the Via Prenestina, in 1923, the largest industrial plant in the city, the Cisa Viscosa, opens and begins churning out synthetic fabrics, specifically rayon.
The Cisa Viscosa will be purchased by SNIA, the Società Navigazione Italo-Americana, one of Italy's major industrial forces. At its height, 2,500 workers were employed here, and the site covered about 35 acres.
Now, clearly, the many jobs these factories offered made Pigneto a convenient neighborhood for workers to live. It was both affordable and close to their workplace.
And even if they didn't live here, the robust transit system present here made Pigneto easy to reach.
As early as 1890, on the land between Via Prenestina and Via Casilina, the railroad tracks began to sprout tram and bus depots and other services for the city's growing transit needs. Rome's transportation was run at first by the private company Società Romana Tramways Omnibus. In 1886, they purchased almost 20,000 square meters of land between Vicolo del Pigneto and Via Prenestina. Their plan is to develop a complete network of trams and buses to cover the whole city. The vast facility here had stables for 750 horses, it had parking for the vehicles they pulled, and mechanic shops for maintenance and repairs.
It must have been so impressive.
Still today on Via Prenestina, we have the headquarters and main facilities of ATAC, the city's main public transit operator, of which the city administration is the sole stakeholder.
In addition to the tram lines running along the roads connecting Pigneto to the city center, the neighborhood is soon cut by train tracks. In 1856, the Roma Frascati railway starts to transform Pigneto as its tracks cut across what has been once open countryside. In 1887-88, the Roma Tivoli line opens, later extending to Sulmona in Abruzzo. And in 1891, the land is expropriated for the Raccordo Nord-Sud. So eventually there will be train lines running parallel to both the Via Prenestina and the Via Casilina, and another wide swath of trains bisect the neighborhood in the north-south direction. Before the construction of Termini Station, the primary train station to connect to the towns in the east was indeed Pigneto's Porta Maggiore.
Not all of the transportation infrastructure that traverses Pigneto is public and green, though. In the 1960s, construction began on the huge elevated highway, the Tangenziale, which snakes above the neighborhood and descends onto the Via Prenestina after effectively cutting the small town in two.
While the monstrous Tangenziale snakes above the neighborhood, the latest transit option, the Metro C line, cuts through Pigneto deep below ground. The new metro stations Pigneto and Malatesta have already had a major effect on the desirability of the neighborhood. It's impressive how Pigneto is so heavily defined by movement, marked by the constant busy linear flows of cars, buses, trams, and trains.
Yes, and some of this modern transportation still flows along the ancient Roman roads, just as fresh water still flows through some of the ancient aqueducts and in the buried waters of the ancient Marinella stream. The building boom, or so-called building fever, of the 1880s affects the whole city, and Pigneto's no exception. The market here called especially for housing for train and urban transit employees.
The area characterized by its industrial nucleus outside Porta Maggiore is one of those areas, very much like Ostiense, that the city's master plan completely ignored. In a process known as lottizzazione, developers like Belardi buy up land in Pigneto and sell it off at profit for the construction of homes. Via Macerata, Via Ascoli Piceno, Via Pesaro and Via Perugia are all the result of this investment. About 60% of the new buildings in Rome were self-built in this way, with little regulation but benefiting from governmental guarantee mortgages.
But now in the first decades of the 20th century, thousands of families had no choice but to live in impromptu shanty towns, the so-called villaggi abissini, in reference to the primitive huts of the Italian colonies in Africa. Between 1915 and the 1930s, Pigneto's population triples, but the living conditions in the slums are horrendous.
You mentioned earlier, Tom, that housing for the train and urban transit employees was urgently needed. Between 1921 and 24, the Compagnia Termini per i Ferrovieri built a complex of 253 homes of the villino type, small buildings surrounded by gardens and trees. The site is a former property of the noble Serventi family. The Italian King Vittorio Emanuele himself came here to lay the cornerstone. The plan allocated 1/3 of the land to roads, which were defined around two major axis intersections at Piazza Tolomeo. 5 types of villino are proposed, ranging from the single-story to a more costly 2-story one. The complex of 1 or 2-story villini represents one of the most beautiful examples of planned, low-density, garden city housing in Pigneto.
For the railway workers who lived here, the green areas were used as orchards, providing the lower classes with an important source of fresh fruit and vegetables, as well as a comforting place to return home at the end of their shift. ICP is also active in Pigneto, building the Casalina 1 housing complex between 1924 and 1928, a project by architect Innocenzo Sabatini. It is located along the Via Casalina at Largo Galeazzo Alessi, on the site of the former Villa Certosa convent. It's composed of 6 economic blocks, which contain 76 small but modern apartment units, loosely organized around shared garden space. Another ICP project, Casalino 3, on the Via Casalina, closer to Porta Maggiore, was designed by Giuseppe Mosca and Mario De Rienzi, and follows a more formal C-shaped plan.
But compared to other areas in Rome where the ICP shapes entire neighborhoods, these projects are more the exception than the rule.
Most of Pigneto continues to be built haphazardly by necessity, with limited funds using cheap or recycled building materials.
The strong presence of industry in Pigneto and the often inhumane work conditions gave rise early on to workers' unrest. Mass strikes were frequent occurrences, with most of the workers taking part, and with them socialist political movements gained a following in the community. And after the fascist regime led by Mussolini takes power in 1922, Pigneto becomes a center for anti-fascist resistance. Local anti-fascist heroes who, like many young residents, resisted the Nazi-fascist presence include Maria Bacante or Ferdinando Persiani. The fascist government carried out several operations of urbanization in Pigneto. 2 rapidly constructed and substandard projects, like little more than cheap barracks, were built here in the eastern suburbs, the Borgata Prenestina and the Borgata Gordiani. In the Borgata Prenestina, 900 families lived in 4,000 square meters. Over 70% of the children were affected by intestinal disease, typhoid, or hepatitis due to the poor hygienic conditions.
The other more respectable housing built under fascism are the case convenzionate. Although the lower classes were relegated to the worst imaginable conditions, the middle classes, many staunch supporters of Mussolini, were provided with well-designed homes and services. An example of this is the project built by the Parisi construction firm in 1928 on Via Conte di Carmagnola. We can see the typical fascist rhetoric in its formal courtyards, these grand porticos, and the monumental scale. The rewarding of loyal fascists was carried out in the public transit sector as well. In this light, in 1934, the Cooperativa of Tram Workers builds the huge housing development called Casa dei Tramvieri, specifically for card-carrying members of the National Fascist Party, in a clear act of political propaganda.
It's ironic and tragic that this very neighborhood, due to its vicinity to the industry and transit infrastructure, would be the target of the Allied bombs seeking to liberate Rome from the Nazi occupation in 1943.
Factories such as the SNIA, which had been commandeered by the military for production of war supplies, are left in ruins.
In 1931, Rome has 1 million inhabitants, of only 400,000 count themselves as Romans for at least 3 generations. In other words, 600,000 people were recent immigrants, mostly from other Italian regions. Pigneto was composed of a lively melange of Italian immigrants from Abruzzo, Calabria, Basilicata, Campania, Sicilia, you name it, and thus particularly affected by its demographic and cultural transformation.
In 1961, Pierpaolo Pasolini adopts Pigneto as the setting for Acatoni. The protagonists include local non-professional actors, including a family of recent immigrants from Naples. For poet, filmmaker, and intellectual Pasolini, the peasants and urban poor represented the only true, pure human class, and he was drawn to the urban hinterlands like this. Today, in the trendy hipster hangouts of Pigneto, you often see the images of Pasolini's handsome, sculpted face as he strolls, often in suit and tie, amidst the shacks of Pigneto's underclass. The economic boom of the post-war years, which brought big money and fashionable lifestyles to the center, had little impact on the unpolished periphery.
Yet, we should mention, Tom, the transformations Pigneto was undergoing in these years also brought experimental work of some quite innovative young architects, such as those hired for the Ina Casa in this project on Via Renzo da Ceri, or the project by Mario De Renzi and Muratori at the Villa Gordiani. And of note is also the Chiesa di San Luca Evangelista by the architects Lucio and Vincenzo Passarelli. The construction is a marvel of sacred architecture. Now, Pigneto remains industrial. In fact, the Pantanella flour and pasta mill, which had been damaged by the war, is rebuilt and modernized.
My name is Jan Gardene. I'm an archaeologist. I live here at the ex-pastificio Pantanella. I've been here for the last 6 years, more or less. You know, one of these recurring discussions is obviously about what happened to the people who used to live here in Pantanella when it was a squatted reality. At the moment of their removal, there was no immediate solution. So what I think has happened in part is that part of the community has moved further eastwards, has moved into Pigneto, and then from Pigneto further towards Tor Pignatara, for instance, which now constitutes a quite multi-ethnic and multicultural part of the city of Rome. And we also have just a little bit further down Piazza Vittorio. And Piazza Vittorio, you can almost say there's like an axis. Termini, Piazza Vittorio, Pigneto, and then Tor Pignatara, for instance, constitute really almost filo rosso, like, you know, like a red line of the immigration.
In fact, by now, the Pigneto of Pasolini has been replaced by the vibrant multicultural landscape one sees in the film Bangla, shot in 2019 by local resident Faim Buyang, who is a child of immigrants but describes himself as 100% Torpigna, referring to the district near Pigneto.
When in the 1970s the next wave of immigrants arrive, this time international immigrants from Eastern Europe and other continents in the global south and the Near and Far East, they eventually settle here in Pigneto. The neighborhood is cheap, well-connected. The working class Italians living here, mostly former immigrants themselves, posed little resistance. In 2015, there were over 2,500 Bangladeshi in Pigneto and almost 2,000 Chinese residents. Along with the boom in immigration, the other new demographic to arrive in Pigneto might be described as creative youth. Stereotyped as hipsters and associated with countercultural artistic initiatives, these younger residents brought media attention to the district, including monikers like Rome's Brooklyn. Cafes, bars, and night spots began to attract a market from other parts of Rome and even international travelers. Barnecci, one of the earliest to achieve international fame thanks to its connections with Pasolini, continues to thrive.
Commercial startups include bookshops, bike shops, and barbershops. The famous Contesta Rock Hair, now present from New York to Shanghai, started on Via del Pigneto and typifies what they describe as a combining its rock soul with the different urban cultures.
Il Pigneto ha avuto tanti cambiamenti, è un quartiere continuamente in mutamento. Secondo me è bello anche per questo, proprio perché ogni anno ha sempre un'evoluzione. Sicuramente il comune dovrebbe fare la sua parte in una città bellissima come Roma, soprattutto perché ha dei quartieri meravigliosi, dove i quartieri la fanno il popolo. Il Contessa sui quartieri investe tanto, proprio perché comunque siamo tanti, ci sono i giovani, ci sono tanti giovani promettenti, siamo pieni di bambini.
In realtà il Pigneto, io vengo da un piccolo paese in Sardegna, quindi il Pigneto, soprattutto qua sull'isola pedonale, si ricrea un po' quell'ambiente da paese, diciamo, conosci tutti, parli con i ragazzi del forno, conosci tutti i locali dove si mangia, quindi si crea di nuovo un piccolo paese. Ed è per questo che non abito al Pigneto, perché altrimenti non uscirei dal Pigneto.
And speaking of new ideas, the Nuovo Cinema Aquila, confiscated from its owners for involvement in organized crime, was thoroughly renovated by architect Pietro Scaglione and reopened in 2008. It's now a creative venue for alternative cinema and a meeting place for the Bangla community. The ex-SNIA has successfully saved the old factory building from total abandonment, offering educational and cultural programs, bike workshops, urban gardens, and far more for decades.
When a natural lake formed following the failed speculation real estate venture to create a shopping mall, it was the ex-SNIA activists, not the public administration, that fought to make it public and accessible. We have heard from Pigneto insiders that schools and the public library too small for the resident needs, and simple things like street lighting exasperatingly hard to achieve. Nevertheless, the residents persist and gradually changes take place.
Pigneto is in some ways typical of Rome's relaxed and occasionally disrespectful approach to urban growth, where things just happen without a clear plan. Rome's ambiguous rapport with legality can be destructive, but it can also be liberating. The street art and graffiti may or may not be legal, but it is in part responsible for Pigneto's creative reputation.
The lessons from Pigneto may be that if the law cannot be universally enforced, it is preferable that efforts focus on the most powerful players, not the weakest. Pasolini's passion for the subproletariat, so beautifully expressed in the story of Acratone, explains the success of Pigneto, but it is a tenuous success.
At the present, Pigneto is still vibrant, but eyes are already looking elsewhere for Rome's next urban frontiers.